Hi, and welcome back to the Big C Church Podcast. I'm your host, Angie Ward, and we are in a series on pastors and power. And today we're going to be talking about power and female pastors, or female pastor and power. And so with me, my guest is my friend and my pastor, Katie Fowler. Katie is a co-pastor with her husband at Nova Church here in Denver, where my husband and I attend. And has become a friend through that process, fellow leader. Love talking with her. So, Katie, I'm so glad you are on my podcast.
Thanks, Angie. Thanks for having me.
And I have to laugh and point out to everybody that I'm doing this in my studio, which is in my guest bedroom turned office, and Katie's at my dining room table just down the steps for the sake of reliable internet.
Yeah. I was like, thanks for having me literally into your home.
Exactly. Help yourself. The fridge is right behind you if you need anything.
Oh, good. Yeah. Good. If I need a snack.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure with 3 boys, you just have mostly fruit snacks and goldfish. So we might have some better stuff, actually.
Oh, high quality.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. We'll let you raid the pantry on your way out. Yeah.
Thanks.
So I told you we're talking about pastors and power, and I just want to hear your story. You share about your experience and understanding of power as a female pastor. So you can share a little bit, if you want, about kind of your journey to becoming a pastor, and also as part of that, like, where have you suddenly realized I have power here, I don't have power here? Just what has that looked like for you?
Yeah. So I do think as a woman in leadership, I do think I have to start with my story around even pursuing ordination and that process. And I remember one of my good friends, I remember him saying one time, he suddenly was realizing for a lot of the women around him, a lot of his colleagues, that part of their call story had to include wrestling with, can I even do this as a woman? So that was a question, not all, but for a lot of women.
Am I allowed? Not am I capable, but am I allowed?
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Is this even open to me?
Yeah.
Right. So I grew up, my story kind of, grew up in a Christian home. Part of that time was in a church, part of a denomination that did not allow women in leadership. So I just didn't see it. Like I remember going, I was probably 5, and I went with my dad to a church we were visiting, and there was a woman preaching. And I literally remember walking out with my dad, 5-year-old Katie, and I was like, a woman pastor? That's weird, And my dad was like, yeah, it's weird. Yeah. And so I didn't see it. Even when we became part of a church that celebrated women in leadership, there wasn't a woman serving as a pastor. I'm sure there are women who were elders, but I didn't see that, So for me, a lot of it was, I didn't have the imagination for it. And as I was in college and I was starting to feel called into vocational ministry, I was discovering gifts, I was feeling more and more kind of alive in that setting, I had to really wrestle with, am I allowed? Can I do this? And I was in context that pretty decidedly said no. And I had some context that said yes. So I had to wrestle through that, even as I was feeling more and more called to pursue it. So I graduated from undergrad, was feeling led to go to seminary. But at that point, I would have said, no, I can't be a pastor. I wouldn't have even said I wanted to be a pastor. And again, that goes, I think, to that imagination. I didn't think I look like the pastors that I see. I couldn't imagine that. And I probably honestly had something to do with maybe my discomfort with stepping into places of power. I definitely would not have been able to name that then.
Yeah.
But I think as my journey unfolded through seminary, graduated, went to Fuller in Pasadena, graduated, moved to Colorado Springs, was working in like a teaching church fellowship program. Lovely opportunity to be mentored and coached. And it was the first time I was ever in a local church setting where women and men were serving and leading side by side on a pastoral staff.
So had you developed any imagination during your time at Fuller? Had that started to open up?
It did, but it was always, it was a journey. So like my first year, I was seeing women who were clearly gifted and called and had done their own wrestling and were trying to be faithful to Jesus as they're trying to figure out what does this look like. And so part of my journey was okay, that's great for you. I so clearly see what God is doing. But it took my whole time at Fuller to be okay with me stepping into those roles in those places. And it really was when I got out of seminary and was in a local church where I was seeing it day in and day out, and where I had coaches and mentors who were like, no, we see this in you. That was kind of the final piece, that I needed, not just the scriptural understanding, but the community around naming that and calling that forth. But for the next, I was there a little over 10 years, serving director role and then associate pastor role. So I think even in those settings, I didn't always have to deal directly with the question of, I should have, but I didn't see the need to, maybe. And honestly, I think for a while, I thought power was just a bad word. I thought it was just don't, because power is misused or power is whatever that. And it really was people like Andy Crouch that kind of helped redeem that word for me of, no, this is a gift and it can be stewarded well, but it's not automatically a bad thing.
Yeah. Well, so tell a little bit more about that. So you're on staff at a church, you're starting to, you have some authority, I would think, by your position, but did you notice any difference then or even now? Like, I know you're part of a network of pastors in Denver. How do you sense any, or do you sense any differences, and how, between the men and what you've experienced?
Yeah, I think early on in my time, once I was ordained in 2011. So stepping into that pastoral role, I remember even some of my colleagues and coworkers, I think they started to name for me, it feels like pastors get to do what they want in our system almost, and don't have to check in with as many people or go through all the same channels that we have to go through for something to happen. And I remember being on an offsite retreat with two of the people that I supervise, these two women that I just adore and respect so much. And they started to name that and how painful that was for them. So that was probably one of my first really eye-opening of like, oh, I'm in a different position of power and it's hurting people when that is not named and recognized. So that was an early lesson from these two women that I worked with.
And that was more about the role of pastor more than gender, right?
Right, yeah. Exactly. Yep. The way that pastors kind of operated within our church system.
Yeah. So where do you feel like, I don't know if you've read MaryKate Morse's book about power or anything. I recommend it. I'll put it in the show notes. And then I've added to your Amazon wish list. I'm known for we talk about that, how your list gets bigger.
I walk away from a coffee with you with 3 books to buy.
Right. Yes. Exactly. Yes. Yep. So where are you aware that you have power or authority in your ministry? Like, how much is role? Where else does it come from?
Yeah. So for me, probably right now, one of the places that I'm most aware of is in our context. A lot of our ministry, a lot of our community is made up of folks who have been hurt or harmed by the church in the past. And maybe like in very deeply traumatic ways, or maybe even like this happened to my friend, or just in a broader sense, I see what's happening in the church in America, whatever it is. And so I think for me, that awareness right now of the words that I say, or the way that I show up in with or without a listening posture, or whatever it is, that carries such weight with people who have been harmed by the church. And as I show up as a pastor, what a critical role that is. And it really, really matters. I think I've just been in situations and conversations where I'm just very aware of whatever comes out of my mouth next. It is said, it is heard, it is received. A pastor is saying this to me. So just very aware of that, and the kindness I want to offer, and the compassion, and where I need to check myself if there's I want to be like, well, not all pastors or not all churches are like that, to be able to really receive and hear someone's story, recognizing that I think my words could hurt. Even more so maybe than someone else from our community that's hearing their story just because of the role that I occupy.
So, a word that's coming to mind is presence. And I mean, as one of the things, like just sitting with people in that. What about like in the networks in Denver, or the denomination, the system that you're in, which is a fully, egalitarian denomination?
Yeah.
Um, so, like, do you feel like you carry equal weight in those spaces, or get accorded equal weight?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, yeah, I mean, I think within our denomination, there is an awareness of uh, here's how far we've come as a denomination that is saying we are decidedly egalitarian. Like we celebrate um, the new creation that Jesus is bringing about now, not yet, but we experience it in part now. And part of that is the healing of relationships between men and women and the way that we lead together. So fully celebrates that. And we see like, well, okay, most senior pastors within our denomination are men, or the different statistics that like they'll name and say, here's where we are and here's where we want to be. So we know the work that is needed. So in a broad sense, I do feel there is space to lead as a woman. I think when you get into kind of the individual congregations or individual, the kind of the more micro, you see where there's like the stained glass ceiling, or where there's those places of resistance.
Yeah. Do you, you talked about your power as a pastor, and a lot of it is in the pastoral ministry, but what about congregationally at Nova? And you're actually co-pastoring the kind of the mothership church,
Right.
without going into much detail. I mean,
Right.
and you and Chuck were called together. Like,
Right.
do you ever feel like um, you were just treated as his coattails? Or there's been times I talk about when I go to like a car. I love cars. I love when it's
Yeah.
time to buy a car, or like love talking cars. But when my husband and I walk into a car lot, they immediately go to Dave,
Yep.
and he
Yep.
would be like, "You're talking to the wrong person," But there's these assumptions made.
Yeah. I think that happens maybe a little bit. Overall, I feel like Chuck and I are able to show up as truly as partners.
Yeah.
I think it's a little bit of our unique setting where I was ordained in 2011 and Chuck was ordained in 2019. And so I'm curious of if that was flipped, if he was coming in with a lot more pastoral experience than I was.
Yeah.
I wonder if some of the dynamics would feel a little different. I'm curious about that part of it, where I think he felt this like, I don't know what I'm doing. This is my first call. Like he was trying to figure out, and I mean, I did too. I was like, I don't know what I'm doing, planning a church. But I think some of our particular story maybe put us a little bit more on level ground than maybe in other settings would have allowed.
Yeah. What about, as you and Chuck have, you said fully show up as a team and a partnership. How did that work itself out? Were there speed bumps, or what kind of key conversations were there in that journey?
I think yes to speed
Yes,
bumps.
there were. Okay.
And some of that is just it was the whole thing, right? Like so we were in Colorado Springs, which is an hour south of Denver.
Mm-hmm.
We moved to Denver to plant Nova. We're also pastoring the kind of sending church. And so a lot of it was I went from a large established church where I felt like I know I can create a program. I feel like the way I describe it is I grew up playing softball, always thrown right-handed. Okay, I can do it. Showed up in Denver to plant a church, to do ministry in a different way. And I felt like I was trying to learn how to throw left-handed. And it was awkward. It was clumsy. And I'm sure it looked awkward and it looked clumsy. And as, Enneagram 3, I don't want to look awkward.
Yeah.
I don't want to look clumsy. I want to be able to throw it, So for me, it took me a while to realize I had so much like anxiety and stress, and that was spilling out onto Chuck and just in our home life. And it just took me a while to figure out what was going on within me. That I think was creating some of the speed bumps in the beginning as we're trying to navigate, like we're having a simple conversation and I'm just not attentive at that point of, oh, there's anxiety is rising up in me. And then as we continued on, being able to learn how to name that. I think little things too, like we moved with a 2-year-old and a 6-month-old, and we were trying to work together with no childcare. And so you just think about that setting of trying to have a pastoral meeting with, this kid, like, so there's little things that we were learning, like, no, we need to do a better job taking care of ourselves in terms of therapy, in terms of spiritual direction, all those things. And we need to have help with childcare. Just all those little things that took us kind of a while to figure out. We're not just going to step into this and know what we're doing, and that's okay. And we can, some of the power, is that actually better to show up in vulnerability and weakness and from that place lead. So there was a lot of us just trying to figure out, this is kicking up a lot. These stressors, this anxiety is kicking up a lot within us, and learning to dig more and more into our own story and participate in the healing work that God is doing in us, and putting a priority on that as a leader, and not simply, I can throw right-handed and I can create a program.
Wow. Have you ever been in any situation where someone else with either a man or somebody else with power has just kind of you felt small, or was made to feel small? Tell me about if you've had any situations like that, and what you learned from that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, so I'm sure
that's why I'm the host, because I asked the great question.
You have a great kitchen. You ask great questions. Probably many, but the first thing that came to my mind was I was at a regional kind of like a citywide gathering of missional leaders and practitioners and thinkers. And they had a segment where they invited various folks just to share their kind of like 2-minute, whatever the prompt was. What has God been teaching you? How have you seen Christ at work? I don't remember. And so I was standing kind of off to the side to go out onto the stage and share. And there was an older gentleman who I honestly can't remember his name. Not that I would name check him, but he was some sort of like prominent author, speaker, And I just remember, as I was waiting to go out, he just started talking to me as if I had never been on a stage, or as if I had never spoken. Like, he started giving me like tips and how to like whatever it was, whatever. And I just remember thinking like, oh, you're making so many like assumptions. It felt very demeaning. It felt very, you're not expecting me to have something to say. You're not expecting me to be able to walk out and share what I've seen God doing, or whatever it was. And it was hurtful. I mean, I think I continue to be hurt by those moments of, and that, again, it always comes back to our story of, where I felt unseen, or just those things like, made to feel, small, like you said.
Dave and I had to talk about this, like if I've taught or something, and then there's some who will kind of all just, nice speech, little lady, kind of thing. Wow, you really did it.
You were coherent.
I know.
Great.
Right. Zach Galifianakis, the comedian, he had a stand-up bit one time where he was talking about his girlfriend was doing her dissertation on like gender, women something. He said, I read it. It's pretty good for a girl.
Yep. I had one time someone came up to me after I preached, I think, and they were like, normally I find women's voices really hard to listen to, but I could listen to yours. And I was like, Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks. And another time I had someone say something like, you used scripture in your sermon.
Like they were surprised by that.
This is the bar.
Right.
Yep.
Wow. Have there been times, so there's been times where you felt kind of demeaned or just not valued. Have there been times where you've been outright blocked, or like almost people have turned their back? Like we've heard about Beth Moore teaching and people stood up and turned their back or left,
Yep. So a very formative story in my seminary years. I was working at a church. That particular church was fairly kind of ambivalent on women in leadership. They were part of an association of churches that were ambivalent, and I was the youth pastor there. I was ambivalent on women in leadership at this point. I think it was my second year in seminary, and but I also felt called to preach, and I had like an opportunity as like the youth Sunday. I did like the youth Sunday. I was like, okay, that's okay. It's youth Sunday. Like, whatever Paul is saying in scripture, Youth Sunday is fine,
Yeah.
And then the lead pastor, he went out of town. And so I was going to preach. And there was a gentleman there. It was a smaller congregation. There was a gentleman there who there was kind of the rumors of he's not in favor of women being in leadership. He's not okay with it. And so I showed up. It was Thanksgiving weekend. Show up to preach, and I was kind of greeted from I think one of the leaders, and he was like, "Hey, we think so and so. We think he might do something."
That particular person.
That particular guy, we think we might do something. I was like, what do you know? Yeah. And I'm 23 at the time, and I'm like texting people back home from Florida. I'm like, hey, pray for me. They think this guy might do something. And so we go into the service, and I'm sitting there, and it's my time to get up to preach. And this gentleman gets to the front. He turns, he says, "Sorry, Katie, change of plans." And then he proceeds to say all of his reasons why women should not be allowed to preach. The interesting thing was he was not, you couldn't really understand what he was saying. It wasn't very coherent or audible. And so one of the leaders of the church starts making his way forward. And I am like, okay, thank God. Yeah. They're going to tell him, you can't interrupt. I'm sitting. Okay. I'm front row, just kind of like the song's about to end. Right. I'm ready.
Time to go. Yeah.
So the leader of the church starts going forward. I'm like, okay, great. You can't do this. You can't disrupt a worship service. I've been tasked with preaching. So the leader of the church gets to the front, gets to the gentleman who's sharing his reasons why women should not be allowed to preach. And the leader comes up and he adjusts his mic so that he can be heard better throughout the auditorium. The leader just said, "Let me fix your mic."
For the guy who was speaking up against you? Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And I was like, I just remember I had this dear friend from seminary. He came to support me, and he just reached over, holds my hand, through this. So the guy leaves. He walks out with his wife, and I go forward. And these are the things I remember. I remember him saying, "Sorry, Katie, change of plans." And then I got up and I said, "You need to know, I come up here with fear and trembling. I don't take this lightly. Yeah. This being tasked to speak for God, to preach, right?" And again, at that point, I was not fully women should be allowed to preach.
Yeah, so I'm sure it's going you're going, yeah, maybe you're right.
Well, that's the thing, though, is I don't think I thought that. I think I was like, God is for me in this moment. And so as I looked back on that experience, even that weekend, that Thanksgiving weekend, as I'm processing what just happened, I felt like, okay, God was for me in that moment. God was not ready to strike me down with a bolt of I was. So that was actually a really important part of my story of, okay, what do I do with that? And what hurt the most was the lack of support from the leadership of that church.
So more the guy who adjusted the mic.
Right. And the aftermath, where it was never really addressed. Yeah. It was never really, I'm so sorry that happened. That's not okay. Or dealing with this guy, that never really happened. So that was really the more painful part. But as far as my own understanding of call, that was actually a really key experience of, I think God was for me as I got up to preach.
Deeply rooted sense. Wow. In the midst of that, public. Wow. How would you said Andy Crouch has helped help you understand power. How do you understand it or define it now?
Yeah. Well, I think I would go back to, some of Andy Crouch's stuff around, that we are called to make something beautiful of God's world with God. And that power, that agency, that ability to do so, to make something beautiful. And the way that is, that does require that vulnerability, that we get in trouble when those get separated or divorced. But that the agency, the ability to create, to join with God and what God is doing. So
let's talk also about power dynamics, like the differential, so in your light of your understanding of that agency, how does that work when there's a power dynamic, or is there a differential, or how does that your understanding of power fit into that, the idea of power dynamics?
Yeah, I think for me, that is something that I'm slowly realizing I need to wrestle with. I think I don't know how true this is. I want to hear you. I want to flip.
Okay.
I want to hear your take on this. Of as a woman, what does it look like to recognize where I have power and where the power differential is? Where if I haven't, maybe as women, we haven't always had that seat at the table or been able to lead and exercise the power that God is calling us to exercise. So I guess I'm saying for a long time, I almost maybe skirted it, no pun intended, as a woman of like, I didn't maybe see the need as much because we are a little bit more of a marginalized voice.
Yeah.
And so now I'm like, oh, wait, okay, now I've been a lead pastor for 4 years, working so much with folks who have been deeply harmed by the church. Like this way of like, yeah, sure, it may be different than Chuck, my husband, who shows up as a white man. That there's a difference there, but certainly as a white woman, how do I reckon with that and recognize that? And so I think, through like some mutual friends, Matt Tebby and Ben Sturkey, and like just realizing like, yeah, it is a little bit different how I show up as a woman who's a pastor. I think that does matter. I feel it even in, in our context, a lot of folks are very skeptical of the church. And I think when Chuck says, I'm a pastor, that hits differently than when I say I'm a pastor to our neighbors, to, whoever it is. Like there's a difference there because of the way power has been used by white men in that office. So I want to hear you. What would you say as far as the power differential?
Yeah. And I was telling you, and I'll tell those who are listening, Matt and I had a conversation as part of the same series, and we were talking about pastors and friendships, and just that there's a power dynamic that's at play, not even intentionally. So, and I was sharing on that, so, I'm married to a pastor, so we've been in pastoral ministry, and I've been the pastor's wife, but there's this power distance people ascribe to us, even when we've tried to be just Dave and Angie. And so it was after, 16, 20, 25 years of ministry, like 5 different churches. But our last one in Indiana, toward the end of our time there, where I realized that when Dave and I are inviting people over or inviting them to join our small group, some go, oh, I want to be in the group because it's the pastor's group. And so it's like, it's part of there's something with the role that either they're attracted to or afraid of. Like you said, if Chuck says I'm a pastor. And some people, when I say, come over to our house, they're going, I'm going to the pastor's house. And so even when I'm trying to minimize that, there's this kind of thing. But then it's like, oh, you're the pastor's wife, or you're only the pastor's wife. So sometimes I've had, I'm a leader in my own right, and I haven't had a voice because, well, you're the pastor's wife and you shouldn't, or we just don't know what to do with you, kind of thing. So those are a couple of them, but I mean, happy to answer if you have another question around that.
Well, what do you think about that idea of, okay, like as a white woman, the way that you might deal with or reckon with the power differential? Are there different questions? Is there a difference between some of your male colleagues? You know what I mean?
Yes, I think so. And yes, I think so. I think I've had to learn more how to lead from the margins. And so that's something I think I can find some commonality with people of color, other women. For my book, I Am a Leader, when I talk to like 50 different women, including women of, color and just different backgrounds, the thing that they felt more held back by most of those women was not their color, it was their being female. So am I getting close to your question, or keep going?
Yeah. Well, and I just wonder too, I wonder both as a woman, but then also just personality and again, as Enneagram 3, like that whole imposter syndrome. Like how do I reckon with power when I'm afraid of it? I just wonder what all of the questions that go into it. Like I remember years ago in our denomination, we have different, we have a presbytery and there's different teams, and I was asked like, hey, would you lead this team? And I remember genuinely being like, there is no way I am qualified to lead this team.
Yeah.
And now I look back and I'm like, oh, child, like you're fine. You know what I mean? Like, but in the moment I was like, you're asking me to lead? Like, I can't do this. I'm not equipped for that. And I was, I was on staff as a pastor and all these things. Right. So I guess just wondering, curious about if I'm new to, okay, all the ways I need to reckon with power as a woman who's a pastor. Yes, it looks different than my husband.
Yeah.
But what are the differences, and what are the questions
I think
to wrestle
some
with?
of it, I mean, and I've done a workshop before about for women, like how to be the most powerful person in the room, and like where just kind of some leadership theory about where people get power from or are ascribed power. I think mine comes from primarily the presence, like you talked about. There's some in some of the spaces I'm at, like at Denver Seminary and the Academy, and with a lot of men, it's because I have a PhD. So I could have had the same ideas, but a PhD validates them in some way. So I think there's that piece as well. And another thought, but I'm 53 and it went out the window. So maybe it's downstairs in the kitchen. Send it back up if you find it.
I'll let you know.
Yeah.
I remember, I was on this team around ordination candidates within our denomination. And I remember like there'd be people who would wrestle with, do I really need to be ordained to do what I want to do, what God's called me to do, especially in a post-Christian context? Is that more of a obstacle to connecting with people? And I remember, especially with some of the women, kind of like, hey, this actually, like you being ordained, if God's calling you to this, that actually could be a help in ministry to be able to say, have Rev in front of your name when it comes to where you might be able to lead and serve as a woman.
Yeah,
for sure.
I think actually it came back up to me. So thanks for sending that idea. You said you were asked to lead some things and teams, and you were like imposter syndrome or I'm not ready. I think I had some of the opposite, where I was like, I can do this. Why won't you let me do this? I've just kind of realized I want the ball in my hands when the game is on the line. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm gifted to have the ball in my hands.
Yes.
And a lot of times, even more now, as I get older and have some, gravitas that people give to me, like I'm called and invited. It's wrong for me to take the ball from someone or to hog it, but and so it was always like I'm a game changer that's not allowed to be in the game because I'm a woman.
Yeah. Well, and I remember hearing someone say, a younger person that I was talking to, a guy, and he said something like, I feel called to be a senior pastor. And this was earlier on in his ministry. And I was just so struck by that, because I don't think early on those words would ever come out of my mouth. But I also I'm curious of if they came out of the mouth of any woman, would those around have a sort of like, oh, you're supposed to be humble. You're not supposed to want that position. You're not supposed to like claim it for yours. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It just felt so easy for this guy to say it. And I felt like it would be really hard for a lot of women to own it at 24 or however old he was.
For sure. Yeah. I was going to ask, how have you noticed the gravitas or the weight accorded to you? Has that changed as you've gotten older, as you've gotten married, as you've had kids?
The gravitas that I feel, or this like
that you feel, or that people have given you. So in youth ministry, once I got married, that now you understand. Or once you have kids, now you understand. So there's this. Certainly, we're getting older and more mature, hopefully, and growing and understanding more. But I think people go, what do you know? You're just 24. You're just single. You don't even have whatever. You're just a whatever. Fill in the blank.
Yeah.
Have you noticed that in your journey or not?
I don't think I felt it. I don't know if I was just oblivious. So I was ordained when I was 28, graduated from seminary when I was 25, ordained 28, married when I was 30, almost 31. And I do remember, actually, I really liked the fact that I was ordained single woman, just because of the way that singles in the church get marginalized and all those things that, like, as if you have to be married.
Right.
I really enjoyed pushing back against that narrative. And then when we got married, once we had kids, Chuck was stay-at-home dad while I worked full-time at the church. And I really enjoyed pushing back against that narrative of what it has to look like and all those things. So people might have had those projections. I don't remember being very aware of that, of a sort of diminishing because I was single or married without kids or whatever it was.
Yeah. What would you tell, we've got seminary residents, interns at our church. So what do you tell them, the women that we have on staff? Do you talk about this with them, or what would you tell them about this whole idea of power as a pastor, as a woman?
Yeah. I mean, I think for sure with Nova Church, one of the big ways we feel called to be part of God's kingdom in our little neck of the woods is to be a place where women and men are serving and leading together, and women, being so close to Denver Seminary, a local church where women can have opportunities to grow in their pastoral competencies and skills and all those things. So that's huge for us. I think, early on with different women that I work with, a lot of it is hearing their story and understanding what it's been like for them to be a woman in a church setting or in a seminary setting. But certainly even as a staff, as we have conversations about, okay, great, we're egalitarian, but what does that look like and practice? And where are the maybe things that we bump up against that we're not even aware of? So some early conversations we've had around that, some ongoing conversations we need to have around that of what are things that we're just not even aware of right now, or blind spots that we want to, I think because Chuck and I are lead pastors, like when you come to visit Nova, you really can't avoid that we celebrate women and men leading together, right? Because it's not, my old church as associate pastor, I would preach maybe, 6 times a year, whatever it was. So in this context, it's way more visible, the upfront presence, at least, of women. And certainly within our staff, I mean, we say that we ask people are you going to be okay with a woman being your supervisor? And having that conversation with the men and the women before they come on to our team, just because it's not necessarily what most are used to.
Did you and Chuck, as you were dating and stuff, called to minister, you were very clear on your call. He was, I guess, was he in seminary or done at that point when you guys?
When we got married, about 2 months later, he started seminary.
Okay. So did you together go, we're going to be co-pastors, or how did you settle on that? Because Dave and I don't know that we could do that, but we also find like, well, then how can we both fulfill what we've called to do leadership wise? And
so early on, so Chuck, his family, there's like pastors on every branch of the family tree. Like he just grew up, his, grandpa, dad, uncle, all these, and he also grew up in a context that did celebrate women in leadership. And so that was just part of his story. When we started dating, I think the question of seminary was on his mind. He actually got coffee with one of my colleagues before we started dating. He got coffee with my friend Joe, and he said, Joe, I want to talk about seminary. Chuck said, I'm interested in seminary. I want to get your take. So they had coffee. They talked through possibilities. Chuck's trying to discern a seminary next. And at the end of the coffee, Chuck was like, by the way, do you think I can ask Katie, like, do you think it'd be okay if I ask Katie on a date? And Chuck and Joe's like, oh, okay. That's what this is about. So there was kind of this, parallel as he's figuring out his vocational calling and as we're kind of moving towards dating and all those things. So for us, we always would say we would love to serve together one day. We would love to be co-pastors one day. We just didn't know when that would happen, if that could happen. And I was in a place, where I was, irrespective of Chuck, where I was starting to wonder, okay, what's next? Where I was starting to feel like God was calling me into a different setting. And so I feel like if Chuck was a plumber, I mean, whatever his place would have been, I was starting to feel like God was calling me elsewhere. And so we're starting to look, and we would often say to, the search committee, are you open to a clergy couple? And it was fascinating even to hear the different takes on that. There would be some churches that were like, no, we won't hire a husband and wife. We've done that before, didn't go well, or whatever. It was fascinating to see where it just wasn't possible. Or they'd be like, well, we've never done that, but maybe we could explore that. And so sometimes we would just sort of ask what else is around. Like if I were, it would be me who was interviewing and pursuing. I think maybe every time it was. And so we would also ask, is there anything else on staff?
Yeah.
And we weren't seriously, some of those moves, we weren't seriously considering them. So we didn't have to go too deep into that conversation. But wondering, what else is around in that city, in that context, ways that Chuck could get a job. But then this opportunity came up in Denver where they were wanting someone to come pastor an existing church, but really focus on planting a new church. And early on, the idea was, well, what if a clergy couple came and did this? And so I remember the first meeting, like they didn't have job description. I mean, it was so early on in their discernment process as a church. And me and Chuck were like, yes, please.
Yeah.
Can we send in our resume? Like it just felt like such a perfect opportunity for us. So it came much sooner than we thought it would, the opportunity to lead together. But that was we were hoping for it.
Yeah, and it sounds like it was mutual. I mean, the congregation was thinking along those lines. You didn't have to try to sell them on the idea.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Wow.
Yep.
Well, I, for one, am glad that God brought you up to Denver, and that's how we connected our paths, and for the opportunity to chat and learn from you in this conversation, and just serve together with you in ministry. It's really fun. Yeah.
Ditto.
Anything I didn't ask you that you want to say about this topic?
Yeah, I just was thinking about the article that I just sent you the other day that was talking about, the decline of the church in America and the increase of women in ordained roles, the increase of women in attending seminary. And it was raising this question of, is this actually like what is needed for this moment for the church in America? And so I feel like those questions of, these are broad stereotypes, so forgive me, listener, but maybe the way that women show up, collaborative approaches to leadership, offering presence, like the things you were starting to allude to earlier of the way that we might show up, the way that where power is coming from, like all those things, like, is this actually like such a time as this where different ways of leading are so desperately needed in the church right now? And what sort of healing movement of God could come? Yeah. And that's why I genuinely shudder when women are barred from those places, the devastating loss that happens. But the positive side of what could be the ways, what could women in these positions offer for the healing of all?
Yeah. And I interviewed, I think, Rob Brendel, at Denver United, and we were talking about, so that'll be, those of you who are listening, that'll be part of a series coming up on men and women in the church. And what our conversation, Katie, really could bridge both of those things. But he's just talking about the need for congregations to have fathers and mothers in that. So, wow. So much to think about. Thanks for being on here. And those of you who are listening, I'll put these links, things we talked about in the show notes, and you can check out some of our other episodes. But thanks for being in my kitchen while I'm up.
Thanks for having me. I'm going to get a snack
Let's
now.
go get a snack.
So come on down.
All right. See you in a minute. Okay.
Thanks, Andy.